Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Charles from Channel Books on Stereo, and I'm here to bring you a really special interview. I'm going to be interviewing the Nicholas Eames, who is the author of Kings of the Wild and Bloody Rose. Now, I have a little bit of funny story for you, Nicholas. I don't know if you remember this. It was when the Kings of the Wild was just published, and you just popped up on Goodreads. I was like, I love this book. Like, let me see if I can be friends with him on Goodreads as an author. Like way back in like 2017 when the book came out, I was like, I just remember you accepted my friend request, and I felt like I was like, I'm so accomplished now. I'm good read friends with an author, so I just wanted to see if you remember that or not. But like, it's a completely random story, but that just shows how much I love these books.
Oh, that's great. I really, really appreciate it. Yeah, I actually remember when I first applied, I think, to Goodreads to be on there as a Goodreads author. And when they got back to me with the email, I was like, oh my God, I'm officially an author. So yeah, the excitement never ends.
Yeah, so like, what actually drew you to wanting to become an author? Were you always interested in fantasy, or were there other genres that you were interested in writing? It's just Kings of the Wild kind of came out first.
Well, I should preface this by the fact that I've got a bit of a cold, so if I cough, I'm not going to keel over on you midstream. Don't worry. Apologies. Well, I kind of, my whole youth, I wanted to be an artist. Actually, I used to draw all the time. I loved comic books. I used to draw Spider-Man. I got into high school early because of art, and and then while I was in high school, I was starting to write a little bit. I wrote this thing that will obviously never see the light of day, but I got busted writing in an English class once. And my teacher, who just happened to be a sub that day, said, oh, my family runs a gas station, and this guy, Ed Greenwood, comes by the gas station. And Ed Greenwood is the guy who created Forgotten Realms. He's a big fantasy author, but he lives in small town Ontario near where I do. So he's like, I can give it to him if you want. And I'm like, okay. And so about a month or so later, I had this same teacher again, and he brought me back these 3 chapters that were fully edited by Ed Greenwood, who had put like time and effort into this, and said this little letter that came with it that said, you have the fire of a good storyteller. So I think that kind of like always stuck with me. Although I did promptly ignore it, forget about art altogether, and go to school for theater.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah. But while I was there, I met one of my best friends, and we both loved the same books, and we both love writing. So we started writing together. And I think it was my friendship with him that kind of kept that fire lit inside me. And then it was a few years later when I started reading Guy Gavriel Kay, I'm not sure if you ever read him, but he's my favorite author. He's Canadian. He's impossibly elegant. And all his books just make me bawl my eyes out. But I read his books, and there's one book in particular called Lord of Emperors, which is the second part of a 2-book series. And it's about kind of leaving a legacy. And all of its main characters are artists for the most part. Some of them are architects or emperors or cooks or charioteers. But it was while reading that book, it was the combination of like, leaving a legacy behind, and then just how beautiful that book was and how much it affected me, that made me think if I could write a book ever that affected someone even remotely the way that book affected me, then that would be a worthy reason to be alive. So I set out shortly after that to write my own book. And it took me probably 15 years before I got published. I was doing other stuff. I was working in restaurants and writing a big fat fantasy novel that will never see the light of day as well. And then I finally, around 2015 or so, I think I kind of not gave up on that one, but I was sending it out to be rejected over and over again. And then got the idea for Kings of the Wild and wrote it. And I think kind of 15 years of like failing and learning kind of helped prepare me to write something that was kind of in my own voice. Sorry, that was to that question.
No, it was great. It's a great segue because I wanted to talk to you about Kings of the Wild. It's kind of interesting hearing your journey, because one of the things that I love about Kings of the Wild is that it defies a lot of kind of like normal things you see in fantasy. It's like you have the characters that are past their prime. You're not setting a story during their like when they're going through all these adventures. They're older characters. There's quite a bit more humor. It's a lot funnier. There's still, you have your typical like action elements. You have your adventure like story, but the world that you created, it's so unique but feels very familiar. And so I just love what you did in the book. So like, what made you decide to kind of take a different take on fantasy? because you're not doing this like normal chosen one trope. You're not doing
Yeah.
like the characters in their prime going out for the adventure. Like you have characters that the guys get like robbed like twice
Yeah.
by like a female, and these are supposed to be like the baddest like um band of brothers like in this society. So like it was funny seeing that. I was like, that's so cool. You don't see our heroes, and typically in fantasy books, a lot when they're like not in their peak or they're going to their peak. Like these are the characters that already peaked.
Yeah.
So what made you decide to set this story for these characters after their prime?
Well, thank you, first of all, for saying all those nice things about my book. I really, really appreciate it. I think the idea of this setting it after their prime was the original idea of getting the band back together, how it was kind of like, you know, you could almost take it as a joke that, you know, that it's a reference to real life bands kind of things. And those are always, you know, 40-year-olds getting their buddies back, you know, and they're all, you know, past their prime. And so that was kind of the original shtick for that. And then, and although, yeah, you're right, you do see it like occasionally, like a character here and there in fantasy that's past the prime, but rarely the protagonist, at least. So, yeah, it was a fun thing to write because you get to insinuate all these amazing adventures in their past and not really write about them. But if you do it right, then it kind of hints at this amazing, glorious, exciting past, and it doesn't necessarily, you know, leave the reader out to dry as far as what their history is, but kind of gives them a sense of being friends and you know, loving each other and having, you know, that friendship, that camaraderie that comes with being, you know, in a band or in any sort of profession where you know, you go through harrowing times together or something like that. So, but as far as like the tropey and like fantasy elements of it, for a long time, fantasy had turned towards, like, from the early 2000s to 2015 at least, it was getting very grimdark, and it was getting very, you know, thanks to things like George R. R. Martin, kind of away from traditional fantasy and more towards, like, you know, if you had told me when I was in the middle of my big fantasy epic that I would write a book that had goblins in it, I'd be like, no way. I'm way too cool for goblins. I'm past it. What am I, 13 years old? Off with that noise. And so it was kind of like, and then when I was writing a book, it was all people, it was all human beings, it was about culture and war and religion and all, the so serious. And I kind of like, I spent all those years kind of trying to emulate my favorite authors, Guy Gabriel Kay being one of them. And then it wasn't until Kings of the Wild that I kind of wrote it in my own voice, which I think is something so key for every new author, is finding their own voice and writing a book that ultimately only they could write because it's from their personal perspective kind of thing. And so I'd hoped, because I had read some authors like Joe Abercrombie or Scott Lynch, who wrote The Lies of Locke Lamore, I knew that there was, you know, humorous fantasy books out there. I hadn't read Terry Pratchett yet, believe it or not.
Oh, really?
I had never read him until I had submitted the book and had been accepted, and I was like, I should read Terry Pratchett. Loved him, obviously. He's way more funny than I am. But yeah, so I just didn't know if it would work, and a couple places along the road, people tried to make it less funny, like whether it was editors looking at it or publishers looking to pick it up or agents tried to make it less funny to kind of fit in line with what was out there already. But luckily, I found people that wanted to take it just kind of as it was. And so the book itself was kind of just like I'd spent so long trying to write, you know, exactly what was already out there. And I thought, you know what, why not write something that just throws everything in the kitchen sink, like the opposite of what I'm writing so far. So that was kind of what it sprang from. If it was like a funny joke, there's lots of scenes in that book. I take some flack sometimes for, you know, we spoke earlier of spoilers, but you know, say somebody loses a limb, not to spoil it too much, but say somebody loses a limb. If I can have that limb grow back and get like a single joke, a good one out of it, then I'll have that limb grow back and get a single joke out of it. I don't care if it seems like things are too convenient or too easy. I don't care. Ultimately, the fun and the funniness of it was what mattered, at least most to me, starting out.
Yeah, and I loved, like, reading this book. It kind of got me back into adult fantasy. For a while, I was a little bit kind of like, I'm over the grimdark. I'm looking for something that doesn't like hit you in the face with like 20 pages of like complicated world building, something that you could just enter in, have fun, and still get all those world building aspects because you do an excellent job with building the world, but it never slows down the story. That's like usually my biggest gripe with fantasy. If you dump 20 pages of just info on me, I'm gonna close this. I'm gonna go read something that moves a little bit quicker. Let me pick up a thriller
Yeah.
because this is gonna take me quite a bit of time to get through if I have to pay attention, because I find that more for the reread process. So when I actually went back and reread Kings of the Wild, I saw so many things that I missed the first time because I was just so I love Clay, the main character, and his friendship with Gabe, and all these characters. I think I paid attention to very different things the two different times. The first time I was just trying to get the story, trying to understand everything, and the second time I kind of like paid more attention to the humor, more attention to the adventures, the more character dynamics. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you was, how did you go about constructing the characters? Because you do have quite a bit of characters, but
Yeah.
especially in the band, they all feel very unique and they all have their backstory. So as soon, like, you didn't even have to mention the character. You just mentioned what's going on in the backstory. I'm like, oh yeah, that's that one character. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, that's how that character would react in that situation. So like, how did you like define the characters so well that, especially in a story that's so crowded, so much going on, how did you manage to find those beats where you can make those characters really well fleshed out, especially if they weren't Clay?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I ultimately they're kind of very, I began with they each represent a member of the band. So they're kind of a member of like a typical 70s rock band. So their core personality traits began with that. So you've got the leader of the band, Gabriel, who's sort of like the loudmouth, full of charisma and look at me. And then you've got the Ganelon, who's the quote unquote Axeman, who's like the most competent. He's kind of like the lead guitarist. If they need something slain, he's the guy to slay it. Patrick, whose last name is literally Skull Drummer and fights with two knives, so he kind of represents the drummer. And then Moog, the wizard, is kind of like the guy who runs around lighting off fireworks and hits the triangle and plays the keyboard for a little bit. And then which leaves Clay, who's the bassist, who is a person who is so often it's like the least glamorous role in so many bands, and that member of the band is so often, I can name the other people in so many bands, but I always forget the bass player's name. And so that's kind of what Clay is. He's like, but if you don't have that bass, if you don't have that underlying, that heartbeat of the song, then the song doesn't work. And so Clay is the person that, like, without him, the whole band falls apart, but he's kind of like the slow, steady, that rhythm that keeps everyone kind of glued together and on track. So that's kind of what I began with. Some of their personality traits were drawn from, the exploits of famous drummers. Like, the drummer of The Who is Keith Moon, and he was, a wild, crazy guy and very similar to Matrick in a lot of ways. But yeah, a lot of it, like, sometimes I just don't even know. Sometimes I just feel so lucky that they were just there. I sort of, as soon as Moog popped onto the page, it was like he was Moog exactly the way he always was. And same with Clay Cooper at the beginning. I wrote those the first three chapters of that book I wrote a year before I wrote the rest of it. I wrote those three chapters, and then I thought, oh, this is really funny. What a funny idea. And then I put it away for another year and worked on my other book. But those three chapters, through all the editing that it went through, and it went through a lot, never changed, because that character was just like, they were almost untouched except for a couple words there. But they were just, I just kind of got lucky for a lot of it. But the rest of it is based on that. And then with my second book, Bloody Rose, it moves into like the next generation. So it's like an 80s inspired book. And that one, it's less like members of a band as it is genres of music. So each character represents a genre of music. One guy's kind of like the hair metal. The main singer is like kind of like the punk rock. Then there's like the goth and then the main character, who's a bard. The second book is very much like an Almost Famous kind of story, like a rock journalist on the road. And so she's kind of informed by the Journey songs and a lot of Stevie Nicks, actually. Yeah.
I hate to say it, I love Bloody Rose more than Kings of the Wild, because Kings of the Wild was already a 5 out of 5 for me. So I'm like, how do I rate Bloody Rose? Because I love it even more, because especially the jokes that you made in the Kings of the Wild about bards always dying. And then you're like, well, I'm gonna send her a story that's told by the bard. So I just like I just noticed that the second time around, I was like, oh wait, he made that joke in the first book, and now we actually have a bard narrating the story, and the way that story opens up was kind of heartbreaking. Like, did you already know like how you're gonna handle that dynamic between that character and her father? That was like a really kind of like I always remember that scene, but it's always hard going back and reading it because I'm like, that was rough, Nicholas. Like, why you like because I would say Bloody Rose is much darker
Yeah,
than the Kings of the Wild.
yeah,
So was that an intentional choice to like kind of move us a little bit more into the grimdark space?
definitely. That's another excellent question too, and I really, really appreciate you saying those things about Bloody Rose. Like, I ultimately think like Kings of the Wild is an idea that's like, I can't believe someone didn't write it before me, kind of thing. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's one of those things. Like, it's a great idea, and I hope I did it justice. I think I did. I'm glad I did. But Bloody Rose was obviously a much harder book to write because it doesn't have like you say, it doesn't have that shtick of the old guys past their prime, which is inherently funny. Every scene is inherently funny because they're old guys. Whereas when you're writing a book about a band that's in their prime and you're moving it out of like the 70s where stardom and things like that were kind of, or not really new, but a bit more wholesome compared to what it became in the 80s, where every band was trying to like outdo what came before and go harder and louder. And a lot of them were very self-destructive. And so Bloody Rose's characters were a lot harder to, make funny when they had to be funny. And as far as Tam goes, I actually had an entirely different opening written, and then I was probably about 3/4 of the way through the book, and my editor was like, just so you know, I would really like to see an opening like how Kings of the Wild has a bit of a gut punch, like a tearjerker moment about 3 seconds. I really like if Bloody Rose had something like that too. So I end up going back and rewriting it. Originally, Tam was the son of, or the daughter of Edwick, and was a bard's daughter in the tavern. And so I reframed it, and that ended up making me have to rewrite the entire book because it's like, it's her character. There's kind of this inherent sadness to her, a sense of adventure and rebelliousness to her that wasn't there with her kind of happy upbringing. So I kind of had to, I kept all the events, but I had to rewrite every single scene just because it was a different person that everyone was interacting with. So it was a lot of work, but I think worth it in the end because it paid off. And that's probably like why it's taken me so long to write the third book, is because I want to find a beginning that's just as good, in its own way. It's a different, it's in a lot of ways an even harsher, darker world setting.
Oh no.
So yeah, making that funny is even more difficult, and yeah, making its character sympathetic might be even harder. We'll see.
And I loved in this book how, because when it first came out, I was like, oh, we were gonna follow Rose, but then we followed Tam, so I was like very interested. Like, it just kind of, would you ever consider like going back and like writing point of views from like different characters throughout the series and see how that changes the story? Because like I feel like in Bloody Rose, it works so well that you're not in Rose's head for that story, because there's this whole interesting familial dynamic that you play with. Like, how do you feel like when your father or your parent is like this god put on a pedestal? I was mad what you did to Gabe in that book. I was like, dang you, Nicholas. I'm not gonna say it because it's a spoiler, but I was like, that hurt. Like, you spend so much time like falling in love with those characters from the first book and like seeing them through the younger generation's eyes, especially with Rose.
Yeah.
How it's kind of sad. Like, you kind of play with the idea like she's almost trapped by her own expectations of what she feels like she needs to be in order to like live up to her father's name. So I was wondering, was it something you consciously wanted to play with when writing Bloody Rose, or that just came about naturally as you were writing the book?
That's definitely something I was going for. Rose, and to some degree, I think I succeeded, and maybe not to everyone, because Rose isn't necessarily a totally sympathetic character, and I've definitely seen comments or emails or God knows what that says I never could get attached to her. but kind of the point of her character was that, like, if you were on the road, she was originally named for Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses, you know? So if you were on the road with Guns N' Roses, would you think that Axl Rose is a really fucking swell guy at the end of that tour? No. You would think he was a scum of the fucking earth. And so I was trying to portray it as realistically as I could and have her be sympathetic, be like a leader, and be someone that other people wanted to follow, but at the same time, someone that was, as you said, you know, trapped by her youth, shaped by her past, and kind of unable to escape from it unless, you know, the events of book 2 took place. And so, and then also, you know, she's someone who is a mother, and that, I think it's so rarely, and you know, so rarely in fantasy do you see a character that's a mother, or any book really, or any media, that's a mother who like does something else that's more important to her than being a mother. And you see it with male characters constantly. You know, people don't blink at home and play, you know, fucks off to the heart wild to, you know, to go on this adventure and leaves his kid behind. And so I would like people not to, you know, judge Rose so harshly for having her own life, and having a kid wasn't part of her plan and isn't currently part of her plan. And although things change and, you know, your life kind of takes a lot of twists, and I just wanted to portray something that felt, you know, kind of dirty and messy, like a lot of rock stars' lives was, you know, like sure, Keith Richards wasn't a great dad. His kids might love him now, and he probably loves his kids, but he probably wasn't an exemplary father, you know?
Yeah. That's like really interesting thing that you say that, because you kind of flip the role expectations in Bloody Rose. Is actually the father who was really like, oh, like, you promised this would be the last one, Rose. You promised like we would be done after this. And just that reversal and seeing a female character kind of put in that space, like, really made me like her, even though at some points, I will also mention, spoiler, like, she does get her first band like pretty much all killed.
Yeah.
Just because of her hubris. So like, she's a female character that makes mistakes, that is a little bit messy, but like at the end of the day, she's still human, and I still identify with aspects of her character. That I was really refreshed to see a female character like her in a mainstream fantasy book that isn't demonized for like not wanting to be the traditional mother.
Yeah.
Because that was something I really have read in a fantasy where the female is actually a mother and chooses something other than being a mother.
Yeah.
And kind of define those expectations and doing something else, and actually the male being like, hey, I want to go back and live our quiet life.
Yeah.
And take care of our kid.
Yeah.
Which I think is so interesting how you play with expectations of just like societal roles for women in general in Bloody Rose, that I really find just really excellent. That's why, especially with the queen, the evil villainous character, her motivations, like, it plays on so many ideas, like what it means to be a mother, what it means to lose a child, so many different layers that just on the book that I was like, my mind is blown while reading it. Like, go back and find other things. I'm like, I can't believe you did that. Like, just even talking to you, I find so much more to go through in these books about.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
So I wanted to ask you, is there any information that you can give us about the third book? I had been waiting a long, long time, and I didn't want to rush you. I was like, take your time, write the good book, take the time all you need. But I was so curious because I saw on Goodreads it has a title.
Yeah.
So I was like, maybe next year?
Well, right now it's not due for a while. I like blew it with my deadline for sure. And I've had a struggle getting it started, because I think maybe because of Bloody Rose, because I was so far into Bloody Rose and had to rewrite it a couple times. So in my head, I can't seem to get out of that. Like, the beginning's got to be flawless, and it's got to be, you know, that perfect beginning. So, so as far as information about it, yeah, it's called Outlaw Empire. It takes place, I think, roughly 14 years after the second book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So and it moves on to a whole other generation of, obviously, of main characters, but also just it's very much like the first one was based on 70s, loosely based on 70s rock and influenced by that scene. And the second was by the 80s. The third one is kind of influenced by the 90s. So basically everything I've listened to, like, you know, I spent 2 years listening to nothing but Led Zeppelin and Leonard Skinner and Deep Purple back in the day, and then I spent nothing listening to Queen and Pat Benatar and Guns N' Roses, and now all I listen to, I mean, I was like a teenager in the 90s, so I kind of liked grunge music at the time, but I don't really like it that much now, so I have to listen to a lot of it. There's like, I do like Nirvana and things like that. A lot of grunge bands that people just love that I just can't get into, like Soundgarden. Like, I try over and over and over, and I just can't give a shit. Pearl Jam, a couple songs, but I try. But the 90s music that is way better, at least to me, is and the music that I hadn't listened to before was artists like Nas, his Illmatic, Wu-Tang Clan, and even Rage Against the Machine, which I remember hating as a teenager because it was so angry, and I had such a privileged fucking upbringing that I was like, oh, these guys don't like the cops? How dare they? And now, my God, you
identify with them more.
What an idiot I was. And so all these, what those artists have in common is that they're, especially things like the Wu-Tang Clan and Nas, is like when you listen to those albums, they're giving you a snapshot of what life was like for them that, that everyone didn't really get. And what a lot of that music, especially even the grunge, had in common was that it was very anti-establishment, and it was is angry. And so, that is definitely kind of informing the third book. And that's why you can see that it's hard to make that into a lighthearted story, So if I have to back away from it a little bit, is probably best in order to tell the story that exists in the world. But also, it's a story that's informed in the book by the events that have come before it too, by what Last Leaf, the main character, has done, what Clay and Gabriel have done, what everyone, with Bloody Rose, the legacy that she left behind. So I think, the music affects it, and I want to be honest to the era of that music, but also tie up that story and the world's changed significantly, but in a way that I think makes perfect sense. So I know everything that's going to happen. It's just a matter of pulling it off in a way that I'm proud of.
And do we already know one of the main characters that is going to be in the Outlaw? Was it already introduced in Bloody Rose? Or is it not as semi-tied as like Bloody Rose and Kings of the Wild are?
Actually, as far as the main band in book 3 goes, you've technically met everyone except one of them at some point. I don't want to spoil them all or anything like that. One of them though, and this is like the one that people will least expect, is when in the very first book in Kings of the Wild, when they go to collect the money that Gabe's been storing from the kobold and his family, when they're in that house, there's one of these nests that Clay is inspecting that's covered with knives and blades and all this dangerous looking little nest. And Gabriel says something like he's introducing the kids, and he's like, that's Short Knife. He's a little off. And Short Knife is one of the main characters of the third book. So,
oh wow,
the third book will feature like a band that's not made of just like human beings. It's made of everyone,
of like different creatures and everything.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I'm interested. I'm like more interested now. I was wondering. I was like, who's the third book going to be about? Like, I don't think we got mentioned. I was like, is it going to be Rose's daughter or something? Because we're kind of going through Gabe's lineage a little bit. Yeah. So like maybe she's going to be in the next book.
Yeah, there's been a few. I mean, unfortunately there's been a cover of it, an amazing cover of it for so long now, and I'm not allowed to show it until I write the fucking book. So, but no. Incredible. Everyone looks amazing on it, and it'll probably be another year before I get to show it off. But I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to excite people just to see the cover, because they might guess right immediately who the main character is, kind of thing. So.
Oh, that's so cool. I kind of like want a sneak peek at this cover now that I know it exists. I will find somewhere. It has to be leaked somewhere on the internet.
Yeah, I've looked a little bit. I haven't seen it yet. So if you
publish it to like Reddit under like a very strange alias, so that we can all just find it, and like only fans will know that it's there.
Yeah. Well, it's a good one.
so I'm like super excited that you're going a little bit even darker with this one. I feel like after reading the Poppy War series by R.F. Kuang, you can like go like that just ruined me in terms of like darkness. I was like, I actually feel like no sense of hope while
Yeah.
reading these books. So I'm like, especially just modern fantasy in general, some of the newer books that have been published make me just kind of reignited my love for fantasy.
Mhm.
And your books was definitely one of them because I was looking for a different storytelling, different stories that were being told. I didn't want your stereotypical chosen one, like setting like your Tolkien-esque fantasy world with all the same elements.
Yeah.
I wanted something that did something different, and your books just break the mold for me completely. So I absolutely loved them. I was super excited to talk to you because I was like, I wanted to know details about that third book.
Yeah.
I was like, where I have been waiting. Don't George R. R. Martin me and like have a TV show adaptation,
Yeah.
and then ended like season 8 of Game of Thrones and be like, that's what I waited for all this time.
Yeah.
I was
Well,
like, don't do that to me, Nicholas.
yeah, I try every day to write it. But now boy, do I ever sympathize with someone like George R. R. Martin more, because my God, sometimes it's just like you try to find the words and they just like, it's like chasing gazelle. They just run away from you. But yeah, I'm at it every day. And like I said, like as I keep telling my editors, I'm sure once I like nail it, like nail the characters down, that I'll be on a roll, hopefully. So yeah. And ultimately, I try to be as honest as I can with people as to how it's going. I'm not going to be like, oh, it's almost done. I know a lot of books that I love too. You keep getting these release dates for them, and you get so psyched, and then it doesn't happen. So,
No, I'm fine. It's like I'm like eagerly waiting, but I was like, this gives me like time to read other books that I've been putting off because now you just don't bookend me. Because then I fall into the trap where I'm afraid to read the final book in the trilogy, so I put it off indefinitely.
Yeah,
I'll be like, I'll get to it eventually, but I don't know. I want to know how it ends.
yeah,
I just want to keep it in my head that this ends this way.
yeah.
And so like we're gonna put the book off.
Yeah, I'm fortunate too that they're not they're not like direct sequels. Like, because it's a whole new cast and a whole new story. Ultimately there is an arc that runs through it and it is affected by the books that came before, but it's not like people are waiting to see what happens to their favorite characters, really, because their favorite character's story is generally resolved. Obviously they'll appear kind of thing, but their arc is their main arc is over, or they're the star at least.
So would you ever consider going back and writing, especially for the Kings of the Wild, their stories during their glory days as like a prequel series? Or is there any more stories that are within this world that you would like to tell?
Yeah, I've definitely considered it. I don't know if like there's maybe like one that could take place afterwards, but the thing is that the world has changed so fundamentally by the end of this book that it's not the same not the same world. I mean, even book 2 is different from book 1, or from how it was in the glory days, because in book 2 you start to see the kind of the dark side of the the monster hunting industry, what happens when you have the upper hand and you start acting like monsters yourselves. So that is kind of the fallout of all that is what the third book is. And it's dealing kind of with the consequences of that. So, but there's definitely lots of stories. I mean, we'll see. Sometimes it can spoil it. Sometimes if you go back and tell the story of the siege and it's not as good as someone hoped it would be, but it's definitely something I would consider doing, even if it's in like short story form. And then there's definitely a lot of other character stories. Like I have considered writing a story from the point of view, the story would be kind of like about Last Leaf and his, the way, like him getting that army together and how much work it took and how much toil and how much heartbreak and how much like how everyone had all these like those monsters had pinned their hopes on him. And I was going to tell it from the perspective of the Minotaur that Clay fights at the end of the book. That just like won't.
That would be interesting.
Yeah, because he's kind of like he's like the Minotaur version of Clay Cooper. There's no quitting him. And the two of them find one another on the battlefield. So I thought his perspective and Last Leaf story would be kind of a cool one to tell, and it would just add more depth and more empathy to that character and the plight and all the things that come afterwards too. So who knows? Maybe I considered one too about the fable getting together, like Rose and her band. Like
Mhm.
I mentioned in the second book how they were all happened to be on Freeport, and this pirate fleet attacked and laid siege to the city, and they burned it down to the ground. So that might kind of be a fun story too to tell one of these days.
I had some ideas. I was thinking maybe the bounty hunter in the Kings of Wild, like having a story set for her before the events of that book.
Yeah,
I love her.
yeah,
I loved her character so much. I was like, poor Clay is like, I have a wife. I have a wife.
yeah. Yeah, well, she's actually loosely based on one of my friends. I was about not halfway through the book, but a good ways into it. And my friend Devin was, she every time I finished 3 chapters, I would give the book to her, and she would read it and give me feedback and things like that. So I was like, you know what, you should be in this book. And so Larkspur's kind of description and some of her character traits, some of it's taken from other stuff, but some of her traits is taken from my friend Devin. So she's pretty happy to be in there.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Like that's the one character I was like, I didn't pay attention to her the first time around. I was like, oh, she's a cool character. But the second time, I was like, who is this character? Like, I like her. Like she has more story to tell. Like the band of women that Rob gave and Clay in the first scene.
Yeah.
I was like, they would make it a good. There's so many stories that like you could easily just hop in for a little novella here and there, and then just send them to me so I can have more of your world.
I even had someone ask me the other day, in the final battle of the first book, there's a character named Merciless May Drummond who's mentioned a couple times. Every time Clay sees her in the final battle, she's getting killed, but he keeps seeing her, and the next time he sees her, she's fucking holding her arm, and the next time she's holding her guts in and still fighting. And someone was like, whatever happened to May Drummond? And so, I mean, I hadn't obviously come up with her ending, but I was like, I like to think she lived, and
and is happy.
Yeah, living somewhere.
Maybe losing a couple limbs, kind of
stars, but
dying a couple times.
Yeah. So it's funny what characters people will kind of get attached to and kind of wonder about in the future. Mm-hmm. It's definitely.
And do you have any ideas of what you will want to write after you finish the third book? Would you want to do like different branches of fantasy, or would you like want to do other different genres?
Well, although it's easier now than ever to jump from genre to genre, because I mean, back in the day, I think publishers hated if you did it because, it was so much of book buying was on the bookshelf, and if you were in the fantasy section, the sci-fi section, somebody might not find you. But so much of today is online, so if an author is an author, you're going to read their stuff if you like them, So there's some ideas I've had for cross-genre stuff, but the kind of main idea I've got in mind is another fantasy setting thing, and is similar enough to Kings of the Wild that I think a lot of people would like it, but different enough that it's a whole different shtick, so a whole different ball game. So, but
I'm curious.
But
any details you can share about this new potential future project?
Oh, it's still I've no.
It's still really too far away.
I've got lots of other ideas that are like kind of like standalone novels, which also are like used to be frowned upon and now are a bit easier to write. Yes. So
write me standalones.
But I also I really, really, really love video games, and I would love to write for video games or work for a company like that. So we'll see. I may take a brief hiatus between trilogies and try my hand at something else too. So we'll see. Got to keep through.
Really cool.
Yeah.
Hey, I would love to read a standalone. There aren't enough in fantasy. Sometimes I just want one book. I don't want to commit to a series because I'm bad at committing to series, especially if they're like a continuous storyline. So that's one of the things that I love about your books. Like you can technically, I was making a video. I was like, you can technically read Bloody Rose if you want to first. Yeah. That's the one you're more interested in. But just know that you basically would be spoiled for a little bit for Kings of the Wild, and one of the characters that's introduced that comes up in Bloody Rose. Once you know that character's fate, it may change like the way you read Kings of the Wild.
Yeah.
But I like how you can have that choice where you could read. They're connected, but they're not so connected that you can't read Bloody Rose and not understand that story because it's set with a completely different character.
Yeah,
that isn't related.
I've heard of a lot of people that have started with Bloody Rose and then gone on to Kings of the Wild, and in a way, it would add a lot more poignancy to Kings of the Wild because of the fates of certain characters. And yeah, it would make Kings of the Wild all much more immediate, and it could be a better experience. Who knows?
I feel like it would destroy me if I knew what happened to Gabe when reading Kings of the Wild. The scene still gets me. I was like, I felt like writing you on Instagram. I'm like, Nicholas, how could you do that? Like, you made me fall in love with Clay and Gabe, and this is how you do Gabe in the second book. I was like,
yeah, I get a lot of people sending me emails about that. They're always nice emails, but and it makes me happy to hear, because, like I said, like my favorite book affected me so much, and it was always in a poignant way. So it's nice to know that even though I'm writing something that's a bit funnier, I can still kind of get those poignant moments in, and make characters that people can get attached to.
Yeah, and I did. I was so hard to let go of the original characters when I started Bloody Rose. I was like, but I want my old characters back. What's Moog getting up to? Is he like doing more like stupid like fart bomb spells on people? Yeah. And like just like completely doing the opposite of being helpful, but he's helpful in his own way. Yeah, so when I saw those characters pop up back up in Bloody Rose, I was like, please don't kill any of them. And then you did. I was like, knife to the heart. Yeah. Did you already know going into Bloody Rose like that was one of the things that was going to happen?
Not at all. Not at all. It was kind of, and I didn't even really know it until a few chapters ahead of time. But once the whole, like Rose's whole character, she makes this promise to Free Cloud that, the mission that they're on at the beginning of the book is going to be their last. And so I wanted to make, her keep that promise. Both to her, the person she was in love with, and to her daughter. And so in order for her to have to break that promise, it needed to be what had to happen. Like, that's the only way I was going to get her to the final battle. So, yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. Especially considering the ending of Bloody Rose is kind of like a lot of people, I don't want to spoil it, but it ends so interestingly where like the myth of Bloody Rose comes to a close, but the actual character who's behind Bloody Rose continues on a new path. So it's like a little bit of a mix of like a happy / bittersweet ending. I think too, one of the things that I love about these books is that the power of storytelling, and like including having the story told by a barb, and like how that shapes the story and how it shapes the narrative. And I just loved how you played with that idea a little bit in Bloody Rose, and definitely in Kings of the Wild as well, from setting it into a POV from a character that we wouldn't expect. Like, I would have expected the book to be centered on Gabe for Kings of the Wild instead of Clay, because Clay is an interesting character, but Gabe seems like you said, like your more charismatic, outgoing character. In Bloody Rose,
yeah,
you would assume that Rose would be the POV character when it's actually Tam. So I was wondering, like, were you interested in playing with those dynamics a little bit by kind of illustrating the importance of like where the story comes from and who's telling the story? Yeah, how that changes things.
Well, definitely in the second book. With the first book, it was kind of more, I just kind of accidentally stumbled into it because I just wrote Clay first, and he was who he was, and I wrote him as like he was a wholesome guy, and when it came to that character, the bassist role is almost the only role he fits. And yeah, well, then with the second book, it was, they're kind of like, both stories are such classic rock and roll stories, like the getting the band back together is a trope that's used before. The bard journalist, rock journalist on the road with the band is, been done before as well. And so, yeah, they're both pretty classic stories. So he was kind of using those as a template when I wrote them.
Yeah, one final question that I have about the books is that, how do you manage to balance like kind of like a road trip adventure type story and not have it feel repetitive versus like when the characters face like X obstacle here, another chapter they're facing another obstacle? How do you keep the tension and the momentum going for the story without the reader feeling like, hey, okay, here's another random battle, here's another hijinks, here's another thing that's a stumbling block? How do you manage to keep it interesting? Because I think one of the things that I love about these books is that I'm usually not a huge fan of like that action adventure road trips type stories where they are going on, like they're traveling somewhere to complete a quest or go save someone, and you just
Yeah.
follow all the hijinks that they hit along the road, I find myself tuning out for a
Yeah.
lot of those because I'm like, okay, nothing serious is going to really happen to them until we get to the final battle. So I was wondering, how did you manage to keep the tension?
Well, for me, a lot of it with those books comes from the fact that I don't outline. I might have even in Bloody Rose, the idea of what it was going to happen in the end changed a lot while I was writing it.
Mm-hmm.
So especially or in Kings of the Wild, like by the end of the third chapter, you know where they're going. Like they tell you where they're going and where the book is going to end up, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an A to B kind of story, and I tried to make it like just every couple chapters I'd be like, okay, what's going to happen? What's very obviously going to happen next? Okay, how can I throw a wrench into that and make something totally different happen?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of that is done. I mean, something like, say, like the airships, they definitely help add, or like you're able to mix the story up. Some people don't like them, or, when I was trying to get it published, some editors wanted them kind of out because they don't feel fantasy enough, but they allow you to, like, especially in Kings of the Wild, it's like, hey, we're going to walk across this whole friggin' forest. It's like, that sounds boring. And then suddenly you got an airship. It's like, oh, we're going to fly. It's going to be over in a nick of time. And then the airship crashes, and it's like, oh, I guess. And so it enables you to kind of keep people guessing, and it happens right to the end. And yes, sometimes it definitely comes across as like a Deus Ex Machina. But like I said, and fun is what matters to me the most in the stories, ultimately. And so I don't care about Deus Ex Machina as much as some people would, as long as it's in service to the story and as long as you can still enjoy it. I know some people have taken umbrage with the fact that there are what random encounters, what they've called, but I don't know. I like them, and I try to make each one as as unique as possible and fun as possible. And yeah, one of my most hated tropes is people in a forest traveling for a long period of time, because it's in so many.
Oh my, I hate that so much.
In so many books, and I can enjoy it, but I only enjoy it as long as it's very unpredictable. So as soon as the 3 or 4 chapters happens and I could see those chapters coming, peace out. Yeah.
Hey, we're very similar on that. Like my mind will just blank out. I'll turn my audiobook speed up, and then I'll just slow it down when we get back to okay, we're out of the forest, we're doing something interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's pay attention. It's a bad thing when I can like kind of like, what was the word? Kind of like zone out a little bit.
Yeah.
For like those boring parts, and then still jump in and then still know what's happening in the story. I'm like, I shouldn't be able to do that, but I'm able to do that with those types of books because there really isn't a ton that happens.
Yeah.
When you have those scenes like that where you don't like what you do in your books, you throw a wrench into it, you do something interesting, you send them on another side quest, you have this happen, or a character from like someone's backstory comes into play more and kind of causes havoc. So I like those things a little bit more because you're building character while also keeping the story unpredictable, even though we already know like you're not going to kill off all your main characters before they get to Rose in the first book. I was like, then you have no characters.
Yeah, and like, there's very few times, unless it's like you're in a final battle or something like that, where there's 3 chapters that take place in the same area. It's always like this is this chapter, and then this is this chapter, and they're all about different things. So hopefully the 2 chapters away from wherever you are, you're in a whole different spot. Hopefully.
Yeah, and you do it excellently in these books, but I do have to ask you, I really was curious to see like what fantasy, it can be fantasy or any other genre, but what are some of your favorite books / authors?
Well, my favorite author in the entire planet, as I mentioned earlier, is Guy Gavriel Kay. He writes kind of like historical fiction / fantasy stuff. His books are primarily based like on a very real setting, but set in a totally fantasy version of it. So whether it's like Islamic Spain or the Byzantine Empire or feudal China, it's always like that setting, and it feels very real, but it's fantasy. And his books are just the most eloquently written books I've ever read in my life from any author ever. Yeah, he is the best, and writes a lot of standalones if you like that kind of thing.
I do.
Like my favorite book of his is the second part of a duology. It's a two-part. It's
Mhm.
Sailing of Byzantium and Lord of Emperors. It's like the Byzantine Empire books, but yeah, he writes one-off books that are just heartbreaking. Feel free to hit me up for recommendations and things like that. And then I'm a huge fan of Joe Abercrombie. Um,
Mhm.
his characters are so well realized. And I just listened to my first ever. Like I used to read all his books, and I listened to his an audiobook for the first time. And people kept telling me that his audiobook narrator is amazing, and I am not sure I will ever go back to reading because his audiobook narrator is phenomenal.
Mhm.
So I'm a big fan of Joe Abercrombie. And then, the usual suspect, things like Scott Lynch, Patrick Rothfuss, I'd really love those authors. I tend to like authors that take a long time to write books because, and it's not always the case, there are so many authors that write quickly and write well. Some of my favorite authors, in fact, but my favorite authors tend to take a while between books. Like when I was growing up,
Mhm.
I read a book that I loved, I'd be like, that's great. I'll see you in 3 years. I can't wait for this next book. And that's what it was like. But
Mhm.
nowadays it's like the people want that book later that
Mhm.
year if possible, next
Mhm.
year at the latest. But that said, God, I don't know if you've read Fonda Lee, her Jade Empire series.
I have.
Jade,
That's good.
Jade City. Like I love those
Mhm.
books. Love those books so much. Christian Cameron, I really, really, really like. Helps that I met him in real life, and he's been a phenomenal friend of mine. But he's an example of someone that writes so quickly, and all his books are fucking phenomenal. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Um, um, yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, God, I read all over the place, so I
Mhm.
very rarely read books I don't like. I kind of know what I'm gonna like, and I just read that stuff. But
Hey, I wish I was like you. Like, I never know what I'm going to like. So I just try out, and I don't DNF books.
yeah,
I stick with them
yeah,
until I finish. Because like there have been some books I got to the end, I was like, oh my goodness, that's brilliant. I think one was like There by Tommy. I can't remember the author's name, but it
mhm,
was like a Native American inspired story set around this one central event, and you follow different characters leading up to the event.
yeah.
And what happens at the end, I was like, oh wow, I'm glad I stuck. I'm glad I stuck with this book and read all the way to the end.
Good.
But I will be hitting you up for fantasy recommendations because I would say I'm not as well versed in fantasy. I'm
Mhm.
trying to get there a little bit more. It's just sometimes the series kind of like scare me a little bit.
Yeah,
Like when they have like tons of books, like I stay clear away from Game of Thrones. I was like, I'm gonna watch a TV show. I know the books are probably never gonna be finished.
yeah. And a
Like
lot
I
of
don't
those
even
books
know. Like,
with like huge and so many volumes aren't necessarily for everyone. Like
mhm,
Malazan Book of the Fallen is a phenomenal series. People love it. Obviously, they froth at the mouth for it, but I know it's not for everybody. Um,
mhm,
so yeah, I try to. I mean, I spent my whole life trying to recommend fantasy books to people that didn't like fantasy books, which is why I tried to write a book that my mother would like, even if she wasn't my mom. Like I'm
mhm,
hoping to recommend Kings of the Wild to anyone.
mhm,
You know, it's obviously it appeals to either someone who's never read fantasy before or someone who's read all the fantasy books on earth.
mhm,
Um, but yeah, feel free to hit me up. And even like my Instagram, granted, I do have a lot of books on there that I just get people like whether I'm sent books and things like that, or I get them in the mail,
mhm.
I post pictures of them. But um, the books I really love, I'll usually write some great stuff about. R.J. Barker is another great author I've read lately. He's got a new series called The Bone Ships. I read the first book of it and I was like, this is so friggin' good.
Oh, I think it's like that cover. I've seen it's like almost like a illustrated cover a little bit.
Yeah, it
It's
looks
kind
like
of beige.
a Robin Hobb, the old Robin Hobb cover.
Hmm.
And it's a nautical fantasy. It's like ships and stuff like that, but in a world without wood. So it's just
Oh.
so inventive, and certain like sometimes I think knowing the author helps me enjoy a book a lot more. Not always, but in some cases. And just RJ is just like a sweet, amazing human being, and his main character
Hmm.
is just so endearing. Um, so it helps when you know that an author is a really good person in real life. I think it helps you enjoy their book a lot more. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. These are some amazing recommendations. I wanted to ask you too. I've been trying to get everyone I know to read this series. It's The City of Brass by
Oh yeah,
S.A. Chakraborty.
yeah, yeah, it's great. I listened to the audiobook
Oh
of that.
my, the audiobook was like, I put you guys in like my favorite fantasy authors category. Like, if you are
Really?
not into fantasy,
Yeah,
here are these books. Because like I'm shocked what she was able to do in that book. Like the world is so vast,
yeah,
but she like slips you into it so easily, and then you're just like, wait, how are we in this whole magical society with like all these different political relationships between different factions? There's all these different magical creatures, but
yeah.
yet it's so easy to follow. But if I started like, I was like just blown away. I was like,
Oh, it's
how did you do that?
yeah,
Like, even the Poppy War or Evan Winters' books, I'm like, fantasy that's like I can get other people who are not interested in fantasy
yeah.
to go like, here, try this out. You won't be like info dumped for like 50 pages and have all these complicated rules, magic systems. Like I would say the biggest one is probably Brandon Sanderson. I get recommended a lot, but I'm gonna be controversial. I didn't love Elantris. I decided to read his first ever like
Yeah.
in the reading order. I read Elantris. And I was like, I didn't like it. I was like, it's a little bit too slow for me. So I was like, I don't want to say that because I feel like I'll get canceled by
Well, the
all the
thing is,
fantasy readers.
different strokes for different folks, you know. Like I have listened to. I think I read Mistborn, and I listened to The Way of Kings. And the thing about Brandon Sanderson is, like, obviously he's a great writer. He's so
Mhm.
successful. His books are, his characters are great, you know. But it just depends on what you like in books. Like, I like books where I'm going to read a paragraph and think, oh my god, like that paragraph is phenomenal from start to finish. This person clearly thought about every single word in this sentence. Like, one of my most hated things in the world, and like my brother, who's my biggest beta reader, knows it. My editor knows it. And when the first time, or my original editor on Kings of the Wild, she's like, you know what, I never met anyone who's so like focused on this one thing, and now I'm looking for it everywhere, is repeated words. So if someone, and it's a word, if it's too unique, like I once read, I was 4 books into a series, and the author was describing this dragon, and they used the word vast 5 times over 2 or 3 pages, and I shut the book and never picked up the book again, nor will I ever pick up another book by them. I'm just like, you know what? This person doesn't care about the words they're writing, and so I don't care about reading it. And it's not always true. And obviously, and Brandon Sanderson's a lot better at that. Like, I've never found that fault in his books, but at the same time, he has said himself that if he writes a sentence that he thinks is too beautiful, he'll tone it down so it doesn't bring the reader out of the story. Whereas
Mhm.
I like being brought out of a story. I like being like slapped in the face with a beautiful sentence, you know.
Yeah,
So
I do. I do like my beautiful prose as well. So like I like geeking out about like the writing quality a
yeah,
little bit, but I do get like the readability factor, like
yeah,
being able to kind of like go through books really, really quickly and you're always engaged. I think for
exactly.
fantasy too, especially when you want someone to read like a 600-page book. Like if like 400 pages or 500 pages are like super, 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 super slow, I'll be like, I was like, why did you recommend this book to me?
Yeah. But I do have great respect for Brandon Sanderson, because you know how he has all those like teaching videos online. I've seen them, but he's a wealth of information. But there's one of them, and it's a like from maybe like 6 or 7 years ago. But he's like, in my opinion, there are only 2 geniuses, pure geniuses, writing fantasy today. And on the board, he writes Terry Pratchett, Guy Gavriel Kay. And I'm like, there you go. So you know.
Yeah.
There's actually way more geniuses, but the fact that he appreciated what Guy Gabriel Kay was doing, even though it's, not his style of writing, then, yeah,
Oh wow, that's really cool.
yeah.
And like on a completely different note, but a fun question either way. What have been some of your top three favorite movies or TV shows that you've been enjoying so far this year or last year, since we're not that far into 2021?
Well, my absolute favorite is the show called Warrior. Have you ever heard of it?
No, I haven't.
It's on, I think it was made by a company called Cinemax, who I think stopped making TV right after they finished the second season. And the second season just finished airing in the fall. And it's basically, um, it's set in like a post Civil War San Francisco, and it's about kind of like the conflict between Chinese immigrants and people that live there, and also like the Irish immigrants and things like that there. I mean, it's unbelievably topical, especially right now. But it's got like Game of Thrones level production values, and it was the original story was Bruce Lee's original story. That was kind of like taken from him and turned into that kung fu show starring a white guy. And this is produced by his daughter, and the main character, I can't remember what his name is, but he basically, like, whenever a fight breaks out, he moves just like Bruce Lee, like movement. He doesn't do like the sound effects. He'll do the nose swipe. But every movement is like that Jeet Kune Do, I believe it's called. And so it's an amazing story with so many amazing, incredible, deep characters from all factions. So it's not just, you're not seeing one side of it, you're seeing every side of it. And then when a fight breaks out, it's the most incredible kung fu movie you're ever going to watch. So it is amazing. And so they put it onto HBO, and because Cinemax went under, though, I was like, this show is not going to get picked up. It's too fucking good. Hasn't got a laugh track. Not generic. People aren't going to watch it. And thankfully, about 3 days ago, HBO Max picked it up, and it's going to be on there. So there'll be a third season, and I can't wait. It's the best.
I was surprised Netflix didn't swoop in and grab it. That's the thing Netflix would do, and then cancel it after the third season.
Yeah, well, I think HBO saw that once they had moved it onto HBO Max, that its viewership went way up, because it's a well-made show. And even if you don't, if you think you're not going to like it, you watch 5 minutes of it and you're hooked right in. So it's really good. And then my viewing's all over the place. Obviously, I watched The Witcher. I'm watching a Korean show called The Uncanny Counter right now, which is kind of like a live action anime about these four people they work in a noodle shop, and then they hunt demons in their spare time. And it's very, very, very emotional. Very emotional. Not always like lighthearted, even though it often is, but it's a great show too.
Those are some really great picks.
Yeah, well,
I have not heard of any of them, which is surprising since I watch a ton of TV.
Yeah.
Like, my favorite show right now has to be Elite on Netflix. It's not for everyone.
Yeah.
It's like one of your like high school like Riverdale-esque shows, but it's all in Spanish.
Yeah.
So it's no English completely whatsoever, and it's a really interesting murder mystery whodunit. It's very mature, so I do not recommend it for like little kids. But it's very mature, so like you kind of open up with what happened, and then you kind of work your way back, leading up to the events. And it's really, really, the first season when they reveal who died, you don't know who died.
Yeah.
It's really, really interesting. Like, I was surprised for how good it was written.
Yeah.
I was like, American shows, you need to step it up. Like, the quality that's out there is just like, if you're willing to read subtitles, like Parasite, I finally caved and watched it. I was like, this movie's amazing.
Have you seen the show Kingdom on Netflix? The Korean zombie?
I have.
Phenomenal.
It's so good. So much good TV. So much good TV and such great recommendations. I will check out Warriors, right? It's on HBO Max.
Warrior. It's on HBO.
Warrior.
Do you ever watch anime at all?
I do.
Okay, yeah. I've been watching, I think everyone and their dog watched Jujutsu Kaisen was like the last big anime that just happened. It was so good. So good.
Have you watched Blood of Zeus on Netflix?
Yeah, I didn't really like it that much.
You didn't?
No, and it's right up my ballpark. It's very similar to Castlevania, which Castlevania I'm very hit and miss on too. Like, I don't like the animation style that much. It's good. Its fight scenes are incredible in both shows. So I don't know what it was about it. I just couldn't. I probably watched up until I had 1 or 2 episodes left, and I was just like, I don't need to see what happens at the end of this.
I can see it gets kind of tropey towards the end with the reveals. Like, the person who killed their mother happens to be like I'm spoiling. I'm sorry, you guys. Happens to be the long lost brother of the main character, and then you have that whole day. I was like, nah, that got a little bit kind of like that was a little bit too much.
Yeah, so I'm glad they exist because they're cool. different strokes for different folks. You know, everyone likes something different. The Dragon Prince is a pretty cool show. It's almost a bit aimed
That's
more for kids,
amazing.
but I still find myself really enjoying it, and it's got some
Mhm.
major trope breaking characters in that show.
It does. I was one of those people who didn't watch Avatar
Yeah,
when it first aired,
me
but
neither.
then one of my friends was just like begging me to watch it. And I was like, they just watch the show. I'm like, no, it's an animation. Like, no, sorry, I want to watch my like Game of Thrones, like my hard hitting, people
Yeah,
dying type shows. And then I binged the whole series within a week. I didn't talk to anyone. I was like, this is
yeah,
absolutely amazing.
yeah.
And this was like a kid show, but I'm like, some of the stuff in this show, I'm like, this is a little bit dark.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Like with Zuko and his redemption arc and his sister, I was like, mind blown.
Yeah, well, that's the great thing about anime is that it can go all over the place,
Hmm.
and you know, it's kind of one of those things like video games. People will be like, "Well, I don't like video games," or "I don't like anime," and that's kind of, to me, it's like saying I don't like movies or I don't like books.
Hmm.
Period. Because there's a video games for everybody. There's animes for
Hmm.
everybody. There's every kind of show you could possibly want. So, you know, my favorite animes run the gamut from ones about high school volleyball, greatest fucking anime of all time,
Hmm.
haiku, to cooking ones, to I forget the name of it, but there's one that I watched this year about keep your hands off. And I can't remember the name. It's a long Japanese word, but about three girls starting their own anime club, and like, you know, like there's just something for everyone out there. So I
Hmm.
think more people need to give it a shot or keep their minds a bit open when they go into, you know, the sphere of animation.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think just like with fantasy too, I think a lot of people are scared of fantasy because you have to learn all these rules.
Mhm.
Sometimes there's like vast worlds you have to understand, tons of history that you have to understand. So I think for a lot of readers, it can be very kind of like hard to jump into it. So like you're one of like my authors that like if someone wants to read fantasy, I'm like start with these books. Don't listen to everyone and say go read Tolkien or
Yeah.
like go to the massive series like Malazan. I was
Start someone
like if you're
on
not
that.
ready,
Yeah.
like that will turn you off if you're just coming from like contemporary,
Yeah.
maybe some slightly historical fiction or nonfiction, and I throw you into that, you're just gonna be like, well, what is this? But I highly recommend to you guys if you haven't read any books by Nicholas Eames, I'll link them down below so you can like, pick them up. I recommend the audiobooks. The audiobooks are absolutely fantastic for your true books. I would say start with Kings of the Wild and then read Bloody Rose, but if you want to do it the reverse way, you can do it. Just know that you'll be spoiled for one character's fate in Bloody Rose, like that may, like we talked about earlier, that may make you love Kings of the Wild even more, but stick to my reading order. I recommend it. But thank you so much, Nicholas, for coming on my channel. Like I've been a huge fan of you and your books since they first came out. And it was just like it feels like a full circle moment to have you on my channel. So thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And they were excellent questions. I had a great time.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And you're always welcome to come back on my channel at any time. Just send me a DM and we can
Perfect.
set something up. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. I will link all of Nicholas Eames' social media links down below as well where you can buy the books. So go and buy and go enjoy the Kings of the Wild. You will not be disappointed. Trust me, I love these books. You guys know I give 1 stars quite often, and it's rare I get 5 stars out. So like that means I really love the book. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys with a brand new video. Bye, everyone.